So this is the second video on the Arthurian legends, and we have two texts today, and I have given you a handout to give you a better idea of the historical flow of these particular stories that goes from the early Welsh sources to the Latin sources to the historical annals to the French romances, all the way through the late medieval period, and then into Malory and Tennyson, and ending with Mark Twain's adaptation of the stories for the American audience, which you might find interesting. And that's really just for if you're curious about it, to look through that document. So we looked at two excerpts of larger works for today. The first being Chrétien de Troyes. We can date him to 1181 to 1191. Somewhere in there is when he published his romances. And then Robert de Boron, who followed up very soon in between 1191 and 1291 with a work called Joseph of Arimathea. And I'll talk about that in a minute. I don't want to put these plots together for you. I don't want to waste this video on doing that. I just want to talk about some elements. You can read it for yourself. The stories are not difficult, although they do have some challenging elements. First of all, with Chrétien de Troyes, this is from the Arthurian romances and was the first large collating work to bring all the pieces together, and very influential. Probably the most influential out of all of the French romances of the period. And this is really the story that popularizes Percival as a Grail knight, or one of the main knights that sort of supersedes Lancelot in the later stories. Note that he's raised in the woods, and he comes out of the woods. Now, this is a holdover from Celtic stories, and in which the woods are always places of magic. They're always sort of dark, mystic, secret places where magic happens. And of course, this is something that crosses over into the Grimm tales from last week. The dark wood is a place of magic. So Percival is a product, a magical being in some ways, as are most of the well-known Arthurian knights. The idea that knights are Christian soldiers, mistaken for angels in this story with their gleaming armor and weaponry. And this has to do with the historical period. This is the period of the Crusades, where the Christian knights banded together on a series of crusades and went to try and retrieve the Holy Land from the infidel or the Muslim, mostly Sahaladin, the leader of the Muslim army. So this has a very political side to it as well. The idea that Welshmen, which is what Percival is, are bumpkins or hicks or hayseeds. He's rather stupid in the beginning of the story. He doesn't know what the knights are. He doesn't know what their weapons do. This would be seen as comic by early listeners or readers of the stories. And of course, the idea of Christian soldiers is something that has lasted way through the 19th century, when the great hymn was written, "Onward Christian soldiers marching as to war." And so all of the weapons in the stories are spiritual metaphors, sometimes directly related to the story of Christ and the crucifixion, but other times just spiritual. They have spiritual applications. Swords, spears, are not just to be seen as physical weapons of destruction. They have metaphorical elements to them. In the story, his mother works against his destiny. She tries to protect him from becoming a knight, and therefore she must die. She must leave the story, because no one can stop destiny or fate from happening. Then we have our first one of the interesting characters, and I'm going to give you a little assignment on this character. That's the Fisher King. And of course, Christ is in the Gospels recounted as a fisher of men. So the fishing element of the story has religious implications as well. And remember that Chrétien de Troyes is really Christianizing this story, taking a lot of pre-Christian and pagan elements and weaving in Christian themes. So we have the fisher king, who's an interesting, or the maimed king, who's an interesting and mysterious character that is involved in a lot of these stories. Then we have the two main objects of the stories, the Grail and the lance. Now the Grail in this story is not really spelled out. You're not really told what to make of it. It's a very mystical device. Loosely it's a cup or a platter. But it's not spelled out. When we get to Robert de Boron in the next story, he tells you what it is. It's the cup that was used at the Last Supper and then consequently used by Joseph of Arimathea to catch the blood of the dead Christ. Sort of gory in a way, isn't it? And then we have the lance, which is clearly the spear of Longinus, or the spear that is thrust into Christ's side at the crucifixion in most of the accounts. And this reflects the medievals' absolute obsession with relics. There was a black market for relics. Anything connected to saints, biblical stories, characters of the Bible, things that they wore, teeth, body parts, could be bought and sold. Often each church or each group of believers wanted some kind of relic to represent their group. And we see this in these stories with these religious symbols. The sin of Percival, of course, is his lack of curiosity. He doesn't ask about the Grail and the lance, and he's told we're told throughout the rest of the story that that's why he becomes cursed in a way, and he must redeem himself. It almost doesn't seem fair, because the characters around him tell him to stop asking questions and to be quiet. So he's only following directions, but of course we find out from various characters that this is the wrong thing to do, and he must redeem himself from making that mistake. Then we have the swearing of oaths by all the characters, and of course Percival's is different. He wants to undo the sin that he's committed unknowingly, but still committed nonetheless. And an oath for a knight is on pain of death. They were taken very, very seriously. So when you see knights swearing oaths in these stories, it's something they cannot relinquish. They have to complete that task. Then there's the sort of loss and recovering of faith that Percival must undergo. We have a reference to hair shirts, which penitents would wear. You would wear a shirt that was deliberately uncomfortable. You would whip yourself. So there are some elements in the story that recall the historicity of the period. Remember, Britain was Catholic in its early Christian period. And of course a reference to the wicked Jews. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in these stories. They blame the Jews for the death of Christ, not the Romans. It's definitely the Jews that caused it. The holy man, the hermit at the end, and the communion in which Percival writes himself is granted forgiveness. And that's the end of him in this story. He exits the story and he never really comes back. So it's kind of a strange exit, but he's definitely a symbol for the way that Christians were supposed to live. When we get to De Boron, we get some interesting things added. Lancelot is flawed because of his affair with the Queen, so he must be supplanted or replaced. He's summoned by a woman, and notice how women keep appearing and pushing the story along. And this has to do with something called courtly love, which was a term coined by Gaston Paris in the period, and it became the mantra of the troubadours and Christians of this period. They all had a devotion to a certain woman or women, which was not sexual. It was a religious devotion, You see that coming up in the story. And here we have Galahad's son or grandson of the Fisher King, son of Lancelot, who is a chaste knight, a virgin. He takes something called the Siege Perilous, which is a prophecy that the person sitting there will be the one that achieves the Grail quest. And remember, in this particular story, the Boron story, the Grail is directly the cup of Christ, brought to England by Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea is a minor Bible character who takes Jesus down from the cross and puts him in the tomb, but he becomes a massive figure in British Brittonic legend because he sails to England and brings the cup, or in some versions he brings Mary Magdalene, who has married Jesus, Jesus survives the crucifixion, marries Mary Magdalene, and they have a series of children who then become the Marangonian kings. Of course, this was something that was popularized by Dan Brown in his book, but he borrowed all that from a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and the idea that the Grail was a bloodline, not necessarily a cup, but a succession of people born of Christ's bloodline. There's lots of conspiracies swirling around for centuries before Da Vinci Code came out. So these are not new ideas. Again, we have the maimed king, this to be healed by the blood of the lance or the blood of Christ. Galahad, Percival, and Bors take over the story as the Grail Knights. They become the three that are to complete the task. Veneration of Joseph becomes a priest that administers Holy Communion. Of course, he's the one that catches the blood of Christ after the crucifixion. And they must go to the city of Shiraz, which is in the Holy Land, again reminiscent of the Crusades, in which Galahad must give his life. And it's sort of a death and purity motif, isn't it? He dies as the perfect knight, the sinless one, the one that has not been defiled. And of course the Grail story ends here in mystery, and that's why it's become so powerful over time. It's never quite spelled out. You get the religious reference to it, but it's always a mystical element that is sought and has a different effect on the people, in this case the three knights that find it. Only Bors physically survives and returns to the Arthurian court after this particular story. So the task that I want to set you for the comments of this particular video, the character of the Fisher King, or the maimed king, is really interesting. What do you make of him metaphorically? What's he doing in the story? What's the point of this character? It's thought that he comes from the Celtic legends, Bran the Blessed. He's much more fleshed out when we get to Mallory. Sir Balin, a new knight that comes into the story, delivers the dolorous stroke, or the stroke that maims him. But he's definitely a metaphorical figure. And if you need to stop the video and do a little bit of online research into the Fisher King, that's fine. But put together a little paragraph in this video in which you give some idea of the meaning behind that character, what his purpose is in these stories. And lastly, you were to pick a Grail Knight, Knight of the Round Table yourself. That was your task this week. So please do send your, task 8 as a message in D2L, or you can put it in the assignments folder on D2L as well. So those are the things that you need to do. The paragraph on the Fisher King, then send your task in. I hope you enjoyed this very brief dip into the Arthurian stories, and that it will kindle further interest down the line. All right, have a great week, stay safe, and we'll speak next week. We'll start talking about the second paper that needs to be written for this class. So please watch those videos. I'll give you some tips on writing the paper and the directions. All right, take care.